welcome everybody to Queer Girls in YA panel. For many years, the prevailing narrative about queer girl books was that they don't sell. Writers heard that agents wouldn't represent books like ours, publishers wouldn't buy them, and there certainly wasn't enough readers. It was too niche for mainstream publishing. However, thanks to trailblazing efforts by queer YA writers like Malinda and Tess Sharpe, that narrative is starting to change. Today, YA is enjoying a surge of wonderful queer girl books, from fresh coming out narratives to novels where queerness is a POV lens rather than a plot point. There's more for readers than ever before. The Queer Girls in YA panel brings a multi-genre group of authors together to discuss the state of queer girl books in YA, where they see their stories fitting into the larger canon, and what they hope for the future of stories like ours. So we're going to start with some introductions. So I'll ask each person to introduce themselves and pitch us your book. And let's start with Leah.
Hey, everybody. I'm Leah Johnson. I'm the author of the book You Should See Me in a Crown and the forthcoming Rise to the Sun. You Should See Me in a Crown is about a girl named Liz Leidy whose main goal is to get out of her small-minded Midwestern hometown. Those plans are derailed when her financial aid to college falls through and she has to run for prom queen for the scholarship that's attached to the crown. That would be tough enough for a wallflower like Liz, except she also starts to fall for her competition.
And it's so good and it's so cute.
Thank you. I was like, that was the best pitch I've ever done to the book. I'm getting so good.
It was great. All right, Jen, what about you?
I'm Jenn Dugan, the author of Hot Dog Girl and Verona Comics. Verona Comics is a queer, loose Romeo and Juliet retelling set in the comic industry that follows Ridley and Jubilee as they try to navigate first love, complicated family dynamics, sexuality, and mental health issues.
Awesome. Also very good. All these books are wonderful. All right, Adiba, how about you?
So I'm Adiba Jagirdar, and I'm the author of The Henna Wars. The Henna Wars is about Nishat, who is a Bangladeshi Muslim and a lesbian. She comes out to her parents, but it doesn't quite go as she expected. At the same time, her childhood friend comes back to school, and the two of them start rival henna businesses against each other. But her friend is actually culturally appropriating from her. So Nishat is dealing with her feelings for this girl and dealing with the fact that she's culturally appropriating while also trying to figure out how to deal with the backlash from her parents.
I feel like I'm just going to be squeeing this whole thing, but I also loved your book. It was so good. And Kaylin, I'm so excited for your book, which isn't quite out yet, but tell us about you and about your book.
Yeah, I'm Kaylin Bayron. I wrote Cinderella Is Dead. The quick pitch is queer Black girls team up to overthrow the patriarchy in the former kingdom of Cinderella. It is, it's the story of 16-year-old Sophia Grimmins, and she is a young woman living in the kingdom of Versailles, and this is a place where Cinderella lived and died about 200 years prior. And Cinderella's story has kind of become the backbone of this society. And Sophia is preparing to attend her first annual ball, and that is where things kind of take a turn, and she has some tough choices to make. And that kind of puts her on a collision course with the ruler of Versailles, and she uncovers some pretty earth-shattering secrets, and they all have to do with Cinderella herself.
So excited. I can't wait. And I'm Isabel Stirling. I am the author of These Witches Don't Burn and the sequel, This Coven Won't Break, in which queer teen witches have to team up. Hannah has to team up with her ex-girlfriend to save her coven, and then all of the witches have to team up to save magic. So queer girls and thriller elements and mystery and lots of cute kissing. All right, so part of what I love about this panel and part of what I'm so excited to be able to talk to you all about is that our books span, a real variety of genres. We've got contemporary, we've got fantasy, we've got fairy tale retellings. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Where do you see your book fitting in with the wider canon of queer YA? And did you think about your book sort of in conversation with another title or other titles, or were you specifically trying to fill a gap in YA representation? And this time we'll start with Adiba.
So I definitely think all books are in conversation with, the other books around them. So even if we don't think about it consciously, I guess, we still have to like fit into that conversation. But at the same time, the Henna Wars is definitely written to fill a gap, because I don't think a book like this quite exists, because it is a rom-com, and it's about two girls of color, and you know, they get to have a happy ending because it's a rom-com. So that really didn't exist when I was younger. It didn't exist when I was a teen. And I know, you know, I would have killed to read a book like that when I was a kid. It would have meant so much to me. So when I was a kid, you know, all the books that I was reading, they didn't give happy endings to queer girls. So that's really what I wanted to write. I want to write a book where queer brown girls could have a happy ending. But at the same time, yes, the conversation exists. There are so many conversations going on in YA and in terms of queer literature. And, you know, I saw all of the conversations that were happening about like coming out stories, for example, about like happy endings or not having happy endings. But at the end of the day, I kind of knew that no matter what I was writing, it would kind of fill a gap, because you don't have a book about like a queer Muslim lesbian who gets to have a happy ending.
Oh, it's such a good book, and I can't wait to talk to you later about it. So now we're going to go to Kaylin.
So, I mean, I think there's definitely a gap. I mean, it's more like a chasm when it comes to representation for queer Black girls in YA fantasy, especially. Additionally, but you know I certainly didn't see myself in these kinds of stories when I was growing up, or fairy tales or anything else really. So I was trying to fill a void for sure, but you know, for that younger version of myself who kind of wanted to see better representation, and it's kind of a bittersweet, you know, realization that I get to write this book and I get to center, you know, queer Black girls in this fantasy setting. But, you know, I wish I had something like this, or something like, you know, A Blade So Black, or something like The Good Luck Girls when I was younger. So I think it would have helped me kind of realize earlier that I was worthy of being the hero of these kinds of stories, being the main character, being the person who gets to, you know, save the day. So, you know, Cinderella Is Dead, you know, doesn't encompass the entirety of what it looks like or feels like to be a Black queer girl in YA fantasy, but I think it's just another option, and we need more choices. So that's you know, that's kind of where I'm coming from with that.
Awesome. And Jenn?
Yeah, I think it was definitely, you know, as Adiba said, all books are kind of in conversation with each other. Back when I sold Hot Dog Girl, I was told by a lot of agents that, you know, queer girls wouldn't sell, that they liked the book, but they didn't think anyone would buy it. And this was only like 2016 when I was going through that. So I definitely wanted to put a story out there where queer girls got to have sort of the rom-com experience, which I hadn't seen, and I hadn't seen it as I was growing up. It certainly, happy endings for any queer characters were not really something that was happening. And then the queer characters that I did see were always men. So I really wanted queer girls to have that experience. And also I wanted to really show messy kids that it's okay to be messy, and you're still really deserving of that love and deserving of your happily ever after. All of my characters are very complicated. They're not like happy, fluffy cinnamon rolls. And that's really what I wanted to, you know, that's who I'm really writing for, is kids who are kind of still figuring their lives out and maybe even flailing a little bit. So that's something that I kind of consciously have in my head whenever I'm working on something.
Love that. And I see Adiba nodding, because I think the Henna Wars was also very much that, which we'll talk about later, is that the messy characters who get to make mistakes and do things that aren't like quote unquote maybe a good decision, and they still get to, you know, find love. So I love that. All right, Leah.
Yeah, so I would retweet everything that y'all have said so far, especially to Adiba's initial point about, you know, I knew that I was writing into a mostly vacant space because there weren't books like this when I was growing up, but they're also one of the stats that I cite all the time, and I know people are tired of it. Anybody who's ever watched me on a virtual event, is in 2018, somebody ran the numbers of the previous 3 years, and the only book that was led by a queer Black girl main character was Little and Lion by Brandy Colbert. That's one book over the course of years in which a Black girl, a queer Black girl, was at the center, right? And so that was the landscape that I was writing into when I started working on You Should See Me in a Crown in 2018. And so, yeah, I think that my book is in conversation with a lot of texts now, but mostly it's in conversation with my contemporaries. You know, I think All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson is a book that my book is in conversation with, or The Henna Wars, I think my book is in conversation with that. You know, like, I think that it took so long for us to arrive at this point that there aren't really blueprints for most of us trying to figure out like what this can be or what it should be. And so we're writing this as we go. We're somebody called it it's like building a plane while you're flying it. That's what this feels like. And so it's a really exciting time, but also I don't know if anybody else feels this, but it also is like really anxious making for me to know that people are looking at like this generation of queer books the way that I used to look at like David Levithan. Like, oh my God, how does he do this? Like, is it possible to give queer kids happy endings? What? That's like, it's absurd to me. But it's also, you know, it's such an honor to be able to do it.
I love that. And I think for me as you know, primarily a fantasy writer, the thing that and it's funny to talk about because now, like as my books were coming out, you know, These Witches Don't Burn came out sort of in this boom of, you know, witchy queer books. But when I was first writing it, there wasn't a ton of queer girls in fantasy who were just like out and doing their thing, and it wasn't a coming out narrative. And I think for me, because I came out as an adult, I didn't come out until I was 26. So I didn't feel that it was my place to write a teenage coming out book. But I did want to write, you know, an out and proud character. So at that time, there really weren't many. And, you know, the queer girls in fantasy were very few and far between. And I just couldn't find the one that was just like felt like what I was looking for. So that's a lot of what I was sort of trying to fill that void of, you know, being able to have characters who just are queer, and it influences, you know, how they see the world and all of that. But, you know, I feel like I toned down the homophobia a little bit from like real worlds to create just like a safe space for readers, or what I'm hoping would be a safe space for readers to, you know, enjoy this fun mystery magical book. And there's still, you know, it's not a utopia for queerness. So that you can still see that some of those same struggles are there. But I really wanted it to first and foremost be just like a fun book for queer kids, without a lot of the sort of quote unquote queer struggle, which I think is very important to still have. But I think, you know, it's nice to have both.
Isabel, you said something that reminded me of something that I probably should have said. And I wonder if you all feel this way too. When I'm thinking about like what text my book is in conversation with, I can't even do that without considering intersectionality. And so like, even though there weren't a lot of Black queer girl love stories that I could look to, I did at the very least have Black girl love stories. And so those things were like still few and far. It was still slim pickings, but like I'm constantly turning to the work of Nicola Yoon, who I think is absolutely brilliant. I'm constantly looking towards Nick Stone's work to, you know, sort of illuminate some of these narratives. Because I think when you grow up in any sort of marginalized identity, you kind of figure out how to cross relate. And so it's like, well, or cross identify. So it's like, okay, well, and I might not see this part of my identity in this text, but I saw this other part, and that was also just as important. And so, yeah, I didn't want to erase the influence of the legends who made space.
For sure. All right, so now we get to take a little bit of a deeper dive into each of your wonderful books. And we are going to start with Kaylin. So Cinderella Is Dead doesn't come out until July. So obviously I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I absolutely love the idea that you've taken this well-known fairy tale of Cinderella and reimagined it with a queer Black girl as the lead. And I think it's pretty rare that we get to see, as Leah was just mentioning, that intersectional representation, especially in fantasy. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approach this story.
So I kind of have to go back, because like it's a combination of things. It's me just really loving fairy tales, especially as a kid. I had like this huge volume of collected fairy tales when I was younger they were like early versions of Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and they were like, pretty gruesome and not, exactly like the ones we know today. But so I had that, and I had oh man, there's this book. This is going to sound ridiculous, but this book came out when I was about 7, and it was called The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. And it's a retelling. It's like the OG twisted fairy tale retelling. It's like the Three Little Pigs from the Big Bad Wolf's point of view. So when I was a kid, I was just really into these alternative fairy tales. And it's something that has always kind of stuck with me. I also was a huge fan of horror novels. But in none of those did I really see myself. There are, not queer Black girls in any of those things. And so when I was about 12, a librarian introduced me to Toni Morrison. And in high school and college, Toni Morrison's work led me to Zora Neale Hurston, to Octavia Butler. And so I got to see Black girls and Black families that kind of looked and sounded like mine. So it's kind of a combination of all of these things that brought me to where I am. I knew I wanted to write retellings, fantasy that centered queer Black girls. So I kind of wanted to do all of those things all at the same time. So Cinderella's a pretty popular fairy tale. It's highly visible. That's Cinderella's castle at Disney World. But I wanted to retell a story that was instantly recognizable, but deconstructed in a way that centered the kinds of people who are nowhere to be found in that story. And that is, mostly queer Black girls, people like me. So I wrote this story that kind of explores how fairy tales have the power to kind of personally affect who we become. And, but also allows the reader to see this fairy tale world through the eyes of a young woman who is actively being harmed by the societal norms that the fairy tale itself perpetuates. So it's kind of a continuation of Cinderella, kind of a reworking of that already established framework, but it makes it accessible to people like me while being wrapped in this very kind of dangerous, magical mystery.
I love too that you're setting it, sort of Cinderella exists and it's sort of after her life and death. So I'm very excited. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
All right, Adiba. So there is so much to love about the Henna Wars. There's rivals to romance, wonderful sister banter. The little sister was amazing. There's also nuanced discussions of the harm of cultural appropriation, which I really love to see. But one thing that I especially enjoyed was just how messy Nishat was as a character, especially with like the scheme she tries to help her henna business. So often in books, girls aren't allowed to be messy, let alone queer girls of color. So I would love to hear kind of how you've approached crafting her as a character.
So I was really anxious writing Nishat. I kept asking myself, will people actually relate to a character like her? Because she is really messy and she makes all of these really bad decisions. And while I was writing, I actually kept thinking about Sandhya Menon, and I kept thinking about When Dimple Met Rishi, because when Dimple Met Rishi, there was so much backlash, specifically about Dimple, because she threw the iced coffee at Rishi, and how dare she do that? You know, why was she a character like that? And you know, I loved Dimple. I really related to her, and I was so sad seeing that kind of response, especially because it wasn't just coming from non-South Asian people; it was coming from South Asian people as well. And sometimes I actually go and I just read like the reviews of When Dimple Met Rishi, and it gets me really worked up, and then I can go write. So that was like what I was thinking about as I was writing the Henna Wars. Because I'm just really aware of the fact that, you know, queer girls of color are not allowed to be messy. Even like non-queer girls of color are not allowed to be messy. You know, there's so much stigma attached to who we are, and we're always supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to be like role models. Otherwise, you know, there's something wrong with us. And I think that's true even of, you know, non-fictional people. You know, like I always felt the pressure to be a certain kind of person. And I think a lot of girls of color feel this way. But obviously, when you're a teenager, you're not perfect. Like, you're very far from perfect. Like, I'm not a teenager anymore, and I'm like a huge mess. And when I was a teenager, like I was still a huge mess. So even though like I was kind of aware of all of this, I also thought about, I guess, what I needed when I was at Nishat's age. So I needed to see someone who was messy and who was like driven by their emotions and who just made really bad decisions, but then they were also allowed to come back from it. They were allowed to learn, and they were allowed to, you know, apologize and recover and grow as a person. So I guess when I was writing Nishat, I was just trying to think of all of these things. And I was really just trying to think about my teenage self. And I was also actually thinking about my sister, who is currently 16 years old. And she is not as messy as me when I was a teenager. I feel like she's quite put together. But I was also trying to think about the fact that, you know, there are girls like her who are, you know, South Asian, and they're 16, and they have a lot of emotions, and they don't always know what to do with that. And they're driven by those emotions, and they're going to make mistakes, and they need to see characters who make mistakes and who learn and who grow.
I love that. I feel like Nishat and Lou from Hot Dog Girl should be in like a messy queer girl like support group.
I would love that. That'd be perfect.
That can be, we can do sequels, co-write sequels.
Yeah. All right, Leah. So You Should See Me in a Crown is a wonderfully complex book. It's funny and it's full of heart, but it also deals with anxiety and chronic illness and pervasive racism of small, predominantly white towns. The one thing I loved was that our love interest, Mac, actively calls out the racism of her white peers, rather than this sort of unfortunate trope we see often from white authors of the white partner sort of learning that racism is bad from their Black love interest. So I love that you sort of flipped this on its head. So I wondered if that characterization came naturally as you were writing. Was it an intentional commentary on sort of the current state of interracial relationships in YA? Just would love your thoughts.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I had to think really critically about is making the relationship interracial full stop. Because there are so few stories in which Black folks just get to fall in love with their Black folks. And part of that is because books in which there is a white character who takes a major role are much easier to sell than a book where everybody in the cast is a person of color. So I understand why we have historically made that decision. But one, it made sense as far as proximity was concerned to make the love interest white, because there are no other Black people in this town besides the one that Liz is related to and an old best friend character. And I wanted to maintain the idea, I wanted to maintain this platonic intimacy between a Black boy and a Black girl. So that wasn't going to work either. And so if the love interest was going to be white, it was crucial to me to have someone who held Liz up, who wasn't going to demand that she do a great deal of additional emotional labor. Mac like comes into their relationship having read Kimberly Crenshaw's scholarly work about intersectionality. Like, she references her in the text. She like has an Audre Lorde tattoo, which is like borderline cultural appropriation. But anyway, the point is, she's really engaged in ideas of Black feminist scholarship, and so I thought that was crucial. Black women and Black girls in particular shouldn't be responsible for the onus of undoing racism should not be placed on the people who are experiencing the racism. That should be the work of the people who have positions of power. And so we've seen that a lot, like in the past couple of weeks, especially this idea that like, and recently even, I don't know how much y'all have been following this J. Cole No Name
a mess
situation.
A whole mess.
And so, there's this expectation that like, because No Name is she's a Black rapper from Chicago, because she knows so much, it is her job to educate everybody around her, and to not only do that work, but also it's her job to do it kindly and to do it with a soft tone, and not even just to point you in the direction of the books you're supposed to read, but to spoon feed you the information that was in the book. So you got to be cliff notes for the book, you got to be spark notes for the book. It's unbearable to me, this idea. And so like, if I was going to write this relationship into the book, then I wanted to show Black girls that, first of all, you don't owe anybody anything, least of all your white partner. You don't owe them an explanation for why you're upset or why it's difficult for you to navigate a space. So yeah, I was definitely thinking a lot about that. And somebody kept tweeting me. I remember when the book first got announced, they were like, is there an interracial romance in this book? What about the interracial romance? Is there an interracial romance? Can you tell me because it felt like this weird fetishizing thing, and that's the thing that I wanted to avoid. Is like, I don't want it to seem like Black girls need to aspire to a relationship with someone non-Black in order for it to be valid or worthy or enviable, because I don't think that's the case. I think you should aspire to be with someone who sees you and respects you, and that's what I wanted to give Liz.
Yeah, I loved their dynamic so much. And I also, because you brought it up, I really loved her, that platonic relationship with her friend. Was it Jordan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. He was just a doll, and I loved him. But I did love sort of, even after all those years of separation, how quickly they sort of like reformed that bond. I thought was really lovely.
Thank you. That was also such a good question, Isabel. Nobody's asked me that yet. And I'm thrilled to answer it. Wow.
Awesome. All right, Jen. So I also loved Verona Comics. I have not shut up about it since I read it. And I think one of the really special features of the book is that it centers a boy-girl relationship, yet the story remains undeniably queer. And so often when we talk about queer girl YA, our sort of shorthand is like FF, so like the F/F. But queer girls don't always date other girls. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about, what kind of drew you to this particular story of this particular type of queer romance.
Yeah, it was definitely something I wanted to explore. So often when you have a bi girl, as long as she's dating girls, she's like very accepted in the queer community. But the second that she's interested in a boy, it's like, you don't really, all of a sudden you're kind of pushed to the fringe and you don't really fit, and you like lose the support of your queer community, but you also don't fit in with the straight community. And there's been, unfortunately, a lot of commentary going around where people have said, like, bi girls in differently gendered relationships, like that they don't count. So I really wanted to explore that. And in my book, I have Jubilee, she wrestles with those feelings of, am I queer enough because I like this boy and I haven't, been in a serious relationship with a girl? Do I count? And that's something, and I wanted to also give her a very supportive queer community that challenges her on that. Like, her best friend Jayla, who's a lesbian, is constantly like, well, no, like, boys are disgusting, so like I do think it's gross that you like boys, but like I don't think it's gross that a bi girl would want to date a boy. It was super important for me to really, whereas Ridley, who is also bi, he worries, as a bi man, that it's too much, or a bi boy in this case, that he's too much. And it kind of goes the other way, where you have bi boys who girls are like, okay, but you're actually this gay. Like, so we have all these stereotypes. So I have, Ridley really questioning, is he too much? And Jubilee really questioning, am I not enough? And so I wanted to put it out there that, like, you are exactly enough, which is, I actually have Ridley say that to her, like, you are enough. Because any kids that relate to either one of them and is questioning, I wanted them to see that your sexuality is not tied to whoever you're dating in that moment. And you are valid, whether you're dating someone of your gender or of a different gender or no one at all. Single queer girls are also valid, which I know we're seeing Rory Power has been having to tweet that a lot, because she has a queer girl who doesn't date anyone. There's no romance to burn our bodies down. And people are like, well, how is it a queer girl if there's like no pairing? And I'm like, what? Like, what year is this? I don't understand how this works. Like, so that was definitely, I definitely wanted to show a queer relationship that appeared heteronormative, but very much was not.
All right, so we actually got some audience questions submitted before the panel, so we're going to go through those quick and then we'll wrap things up. So first question, and this one will kind of popcorn around, and whoever wants to answer first can go first, but how much of your personal life or personal experiences do you actually put into your books?
So when they say to write what you know, honey, I wrote what I knew, and you should see me in a crown. You have a queer Black girl growing up in rural adjacent Indiana with deep anxiety and these, growing up in relative poverty, who has a deep sense of duty to her family and is bound by that duty to do things with her life that will one day be able to make her family more comfortable. The book is not autobiographical, but all of those things are things that I, at one point, and most of them at present, are, wrestling with. And I think that it came from a place of wanting to create for, teenage me, a book that was permission giving. If I didn't see any of those things, if I didn't see myself reflected in any of those ways growing up, then if I only got one shot to write a book, then I wanted to make sure that that book was the book that checked all the boxes that I needed it to check when I was a young reader. And so the next book I'm writing is slightly less, pulled from the headlines, and by the headlines I mean my life. But still, I always integrate aspects of myself and the things that matter the most to me into my books in some way. So the next book takes place at a music festival, because that's like my favorite place in the world. So who knows where we're going to end up next? Maybe show choir, because that's the only other thing I hear.
Yes.
I'm very similar to Leah, I guess. I also pull a lot from my life, my real life experiences. Not as much as Leah. Like, this all the stuff that Nisha goes through, I haven't gone through it. But definitely, like, a lot of like the micro and macro aggressions that she faces, it's pulled from stuff that's happened to me. Like the character of China. I'm not going to say exactly who she's based off of, but I definitely had a China in my life when I was Nishat's age. And her name was not China, but I think you guys can probably guess what her name was. So yeah, like so much of the stuff in the book, like the stuff about race, about cultural appropriation, about queerness, all of that stuff, I've experienced in my life. Some of it I still experience in my life. And it's kind of similar for Flavia as well. I'm obviously not like a biracial, bisexual Brazilian person, but I do know a lot of people who have those identities. I have a lot of friends who are Brazilian. I have a lot of students who are Brazilian. So a lot of that just comes from, people that I know and what I know of their experiences as well. So when I write, I always try to root it in stuff that I know, just because I think for me, when I'm being honest on the page, I'm doing my best writing. So I guess I just try to be honest when I write.
I also include so much, too much probably. Verona Comics was definitely my most personal, where I really put a lot of my life into it. I also do indie comics. I spend a lot of time at Comic-Cons. I'm always part of that, like indie versus like major big two battle that goes on through the book. But also a lot of the feelings that kids have, and especially like the anxiety and all kinds of that kind of stuff. So I said, after I turned that book in, I said, I'm not going to get that personal again, because that was like very like raw on the page stuff. And then I immediately turned around, and my book next, that's coming out next year, Some Girls Do, is loosely based on a scenario that I had with a girlfriend in high school. So I'm like right back. It lasted, a good like 5 minutes before I'm like, what else can I mine from my past and, put out on a platter for you.
Mm-hmm.
Cinderella Is Dead has a lot of me in it. I definitely, understand what it's like to just kind of have to hide your feelings, especially when you're younger and, you have that kind of, that first kind of really intense relationship with someone, and you can't say anything about it just because of the way, either your family is or, your community. And so that definitely resonates with me. Also just kind of the way this community reacts to seeing young women in pain, in really bad situations. They just kind of allow it to happen. No one speaks up. No one says anything. So I kind of, that's also a really personal experience, something that I've experienced in my life. And, but there's also a lot of joy in this book. And I think that is something that, cannot be understated. Sophia finds her voice, and I was able to do that too. And so, she gets to a point where she's kind of willing to risk it all because she knows who she is and what she wants. And so that's me too. And so it's a fantasy, so there's a lot of, magical elements, and but those kind of core beliefs and those kind of, those the way that Sophia kind of feels, those are definitely me.
Yeah, and I think for me, like especially writing fantasy, I don't think I actively put a ton of sort of specific experiences, because I'm not writing contemporary, but I put a lot of, usually unintentionally, and then I read back and I'm like, oh, those are all of my personal feelings about things. Also a little bit of my humor gets in there. But I think it's especially noticeable for me in the book I'm working on for my 2021, The Coldest Touch, which is about vampires, and yet it is somehow the most personal book I've ever written. And I'm like reading back through the pages and I'm like, oh no, I feel so exposed by all of my feelings that I had, especially when I was a teen, of like, the whole like, do people like me as a person, or do they just want, the advice that I can give them, or do they just want these things that I can do for them, or do they actually like me as a person? So that's all sorts of in that vampire book. But yeah, I don't usually like take a scenario from my life, but I do end up putting a lot of the emotional truth into my stories. All right, the next audience question we had was thoughts on coming out stories in YA. And I'll just go first quick because my answer is pretty quick, and I kind of touched on it before, is when I was working on These Witches Don't Burn and This Coven Won't Break, I didn't want to do a coming out story just because as I came out as an adult, I didn't quite feel like I knew how to approach that, and what didn't, I never experienced sort of that stress or anxiety of being a teen and so living under your parents' roof and having to come out. But for the book that I'm working on, The Coldest Touch, I'm attempting to explore sort of the how it can be really confusing to come out when you're bisexual and you have always liked and you knew you liked guys, and then all of a sudden sort of that like slow confusing realization that you also like people who aren't guys. So I'm attempting that in this new one, but it was very messy and confusing for me, and I was 26. So I'm trying to figure out what that'd be like if you're 16, is what I'm currently working on.
For me, when I was querying the Henna Wars, or I was going to start querying the Henna Wars, I noticed that agents were all saying, I don't want a coming out story. Like, don't send me your coming out stories. And I was just sitting there like, why? You know, coming out story that reflects my experience. There's no coming out story that reflects anything even close to like my experiences, and most of my friends' experiences. Like I was sitting there thinking, like, have I read even a single coming out story about like a queer person of color? And I don't think I could think of like a single one. Can you think of one, Leah?
No. And I'm over here racking my brain.
So I was just like, so we're done just because we have like Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda. That's all. So I was very anxious when I started querying because I kept thinking like nobody's going to take this on because it's technically a coming out story, even though it's not really. But thankfully, it worked out. I did get an agent. But then obviously I had the anxiety, like when people read it, are they going to have the reaction that agents have? Or agents had, that they're going to say, this is a coming out story. But, with the Henna Wars, what I wanted to write was not just a coming out story. That's why it begins with like Nishat coming out, because even though it's about her coming out, it's not really. And I also just really want to explore what it means to come out versus what it means to be outed. Because when I was a teen, like, so many people would speak about, queer people that we knew, and they would out them unintentionally. And I knew that they didn't mean any harm, but also that it could be so harmful. So what I wanted to write was a book where we could explore like the weight of both of those things. And I know that so many people, like, they don't like books with forced outings and they don't like books with coming out stories. But I just wanted to write in the space where we got to see what those two things would be like for a queer person of color.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting too with the whole like sort of the forcible outing, and people, I know even in the queer community online, we get some pushback on those stories, but I know because I actually work at an LGBTQ center and I work with a lot of teens, and it is still unfortunately really, really common that kids are outed against their will in school these days. And so I think, those of us who maybe are reading a ton of this and see it a lot, maybe, especially as, a lot of the adult readers be like, oh, we see it too much. And, why can't we just have a book without it? And it's like, it's the reality for so many kids. Even like well, I won't say who because it's their business, but like I know a lot of people, people my age, people who are currently 16 who were outed, and it makes a big impact on them. So I love that you did kind of both in yours.
Yeah, I want to add on to what Adiba said, and just like I don't know. I can't even articulate why it's so frustrating to hear this, because it's like, oh, we've evolved past the need for coming out stories. It's like everything is suddenly overdone the minute people of color have any type of access to it. And so, we busted down the doors, kicked it in, elbowed it in, and then all of a sudden it's like, you know what? We've seen quite enough Cinderella retellings from you Black, so now we're gonna no, we haven't. It's like the door has to be shut as soon as one of us like fights our way into it. And that goes for any trope. I remember when I started working on Crown, I was telling Christina Forrest, the author of I Want to Be Where You Are, which is one of the cutest like Black kid love stories I've ever read in my life. And I was like, man, I just feel like another prom story, like who needs that? Like maybe this is taking up space that it doesn't need to take up, and blah blah. And she said, Leah, I want you to look around. First of all, relax. I want you to look around and tell me how many stories like this you've seen over the course of your life that star a girl like the one that's the main character in your book. And I was like, None. And she's like, exactly. The burden isn't on Black folks to reinvent the wheel when we sit down to write a book, because we haven't had access to these spaces long enough for any of these narratives to be overdone. You know what I mean? And so I go into every book knowing, with that knowledge that, like, even if white folks have been doing this for generations, because we're still at the beginning of what this is going to become for the rest of us, there's no way for it to be, trite or overdone. Like, this is still unfounded territory for us. And so there is an outing in my book. Liz does not come out to her community because she wants to. She's out because someone forces her out. And I think there has to be a place for that still. There has to be. And I understand people's exhaustion with it. Lord knows I've read plenty of it, but until all of us get a chance to, sit at the table, I'm going to keep building the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that, the stories are still needed. There are still people who are trying to find a way, to come out. There are still people questioning if that's even something that they should do. And when you have a variety of stories that kind of show you different ways that happens, and that that maybe that could be you. It's like our kids still deserve to have those stories. So, and yeah, the trope of, it's done and over with. And I'm like, well, who said it's done and over with? Like, it's not over until everybody gets a turn. And I just, the coming out stories are still needed. And it kind of breaks my heart to think that there's, the gatekeepers, the people who are kind of, seeing these things are saying, well, we don't want any more of that. But I know for a fact personally, that there are people who need these stories, and they need to see themselves. They need to see queer Black girls coming out. They need to see themselves reflected there. So it's still needed, and it's still valid. And there's also, I don't know anybody who kind of comes out one time and it's a done deal. Like, there's kind of this thing that happens where you're constantly kind of coming out in different situations to different people, in different kind of community spaces. So all of those stories are needed, and they're not overdone. They're not. We still need them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I have a coming out to a certain extent. I have a closeted character in my 2021 release. So I certainly think the stories are still needed. I'm excited that we are getting stories beyond that in the queer canon, but I don't think that there's ever going to be a time where we don't need stories like that as a part of it. In my next book, I explore someone who is very out and proud, who falls for someone who it's not safe for them to be out. And what that looks like, and the strain that puts on people, and how there's that push to pull, and there's no right answer because neither of them are wrong. And that's a situation that I think a lot of teens deal with. I've dealt with it throughout my life. And, I think that is something that is good to get out there. And in my books, I always try to kind of not give advice. I'm not like hitting people over the head, but I want to give them tools and strategies. And I kind of like work that stuff in. And so I just think, I don't think like those stories will ever be done or not needed, because every coming out is incredibly different too. There's not just one universal, this is how you come out. That would be super nice if they're like, so easy if they're like, like, please turn to page 62 in the Queer Friends Handbook. But I think as long as there's, there's always going to be need for it. Yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, and I think to Kaylin's point too, thinking about, even though Hannah and These Witches Don't Burn is very out and proud from page one. Like the very first page is sort of like reminding the reader of like a year ago when she came out. She still has a new coworker and sort of kind of unintentionally outs herself by mentioning her ex-girlfriend, and that there's that moment of like, oh no, is this person going to react weird, even though she is already out and proud. And I think it's very true. I know to my life, like having to, in previous jobs, having to kind of always weigh the cost benefit of, do I want to be out to this coworker? Do I want to talk about my spouse or my wife? Or do I, so having to kind of walk those lines of, listening to people say bigoted things and then having them be shocked when you didn't come out to them. It's like, I wonder why. All right. So I think we're coming up close on time. So I want to do one more audience question, and then we'll start wrapping things up. So do folks want to talk about writing journeys or some favorite queer girls in YA? Any votes?
Writing journeys for me, that's what I would vote.
Yeah, let's talk about some craft stuff. Yeah.
Cool. So the audience question for that was, one thing you wish you'd known before starting your writing journey.
So I can jump straight into this, actually. And this is something that actually another writer who's been in the game longer than me told me recently, because, I'm 2 books in and I'm still very much falling into this. I wish somebody would have told me earlier, don't fall into the gratitude trap. I think for so many of us, it just feels so good that somebody is, ready to validate our skill or our book or our worth in this industry, and they offer you something, and you jump at it because like, oh yeah, sure, of course I'll do that, even though it's like, you don't have to do every event for free. You should be getting paid to speak places. You don't have to take what a contract says at face value. You should renegotiate. Just because you're appreciative doesn't mean you have to be impressionable. And so, I would encourage a young Leah Johnson, but any young, specifically young queer writer, don't let anybody offer you scraps and tell you it's a feast, because that's not it. That's not the game.
100%. That is amazing advice. I love that.
Which isn't even craft advice. That's just like, that's just like business advice. But, craft advice, same thing. I don't know how it would apply craft-wise, but somebody would.
I feel like navigating the business is sort of part of the craft. Because the business is very opaque for no apparent reason. Well, we know the reason.
Right. I feel like Publishing Paid Me has shown us exactly why nobody tells you anything.
Yep. Yeah, I'm very excited to see the, I know some people are working on the stats around that, and I'm very curious to see sort of like the, I think we all saw kind of the gut punch of what we were seeing, but to actually sort of see it laid out in a more methodical way will be really interesting. Anybody else want to talk about things they wish they'd known before starting?
Okay, this is gonna just taxes. Like, just somebody should have, you know what I mean? Like, I knew, like, you have to listen, pay attention to your taxes. I need somebody to, give me a more detailed. I'm looking around my team and I'm just like, I need somebody to let me know what to do about these taxes, because what is it? It's a lot. And it's more than you think it is. And that's a very, that's dealing with money and everything else. But I'm just saying, like, you got to take care of those taxes.
I have a very detailed spreadsheet. If anybody wants to see it, I'll show you how I keep track.
Isabel's very good with spreadsheets. She's very good with index cards. If you need official analytical details,
I'm a budgeting nerd, so I have all sorts of things. Sorry, go ahead.
I feel like, even though these are kind of like nuts and bolts, like writing things, these are things that, like, traditionally, especially people of color, like, we don't have access to this information. It's not like we have generations and generations of thousands and thousands of writers to be like, oh, any one of these people could tell us what it is and what it ain't.
Yeah.
Like, most of us are out here fumbling around in the dark until, a Bethany C. Morrow comes along and says, Leah, tighten up. This is
yeah.
Yeah, I think I came from a business background, my day job prior to this, where I worked with, I was practice manager for a lot of businesses, and I would take struggling businesses and like turn them around. So when I came in, I was very like on it with the business stuff, and to a level that seemed to kind of really surprise my team, because I'd be like, well, no, like what? But until I started talking to like my debut class and stuff, I didn't realize how hard, if you aren't coming in knowing business, how hard it is to really just get swept away in a really bad way and make mistakes. All of a sudden, in my debut class, there was, it was tax time and people hadn't saved their money, and like they were like shocked and all this. So I think, I think as a whole, all of the nuts and bolts of the business, we should be, a lot more transparent, not just when it comes to, definitely publishing paid me and those kind of things. But I think we should be more transparent as to like, you're running a small business when you become a writer, whether you still have a day job or not, your career is a small business. You have to account for like, am I going to have to, if I happen to be lucky enough to get invited to a festival, do I have to get myself there? Do I need to set aside money for promo? Am I, because a lot of times these books don't get all the promotion that they deserve. And so some of that falls, unfortunately onto the author. And you don't know that when you're first coming into the business. And so I wish that, established writers, for me, it was really shocking that established writers who I thought were like living this glamorous life, because there's this, we all want to look very successful, right? And I didn't know, like, oh, they sent themselves. Like, I assumed, oh, the publisher paid for their flight and put them up in a hotel and they're doing this glamorous festival. And then it's like, no, it's on their Discover card, and now they have to pay it off with their, like, their advance that's split 2 or 3 ways, that's spread over potentially 2 years. Those are things that, like, I think we should all be talking more about, because it can be so shocking. I think there was still, even with my background, I'm continuously astounded, especially from an economic standpoint. I don't understand what rules this business follows. Like, a lot of times it goes against, like, I'm like, well, this is how I would do it if you were like my business. But the Big Five is like, we have our own secret formula. I'm like, okay.
I agree with everything that has been said so far. They were all really good points. This might sound a little bit weird, but I think what I would like to tell myself, if I could go back before all of this, I would say to enjoy all the good things, because I feel like when you are debuting, especially, you get so caught up in all of the things that you need to do, and you get like, there is so much to do. Like, it gets very hectic, and like, we're all like working on our next books, and we're thinking about like our writing career and like our Goodreads reviews and all of these things that can get us really down. So I think sometimes you just forget that we have accomplished a lot. We've written a book, we've revised it, we've put so much work into it, and it's going out of the world. And that's like a huge accomplishment. And we need to take the time to like appreciate that. We need to take the time to enjoy that. And, all of the stuff that we're doing outside of just writing the book as well. Like the fact that we're all doing this panel, that's an accomplishment in itself. And we need to like enjoy that. And we need to like give ourselves a pat on the back and say, good job, you're doing all of this stuff. So not just getting down about all of like the bad stuff about publishing, but enjoying all of the good things as well.
Just jumping off that, I would go back in time and tell debuting me to immediately block Goodreads.
That's it right there. Block it. Yep. Yeah. That's it right there.
That is definitely, and that will give you back so much of your joy. Right there.
You know what? Yeah. While we're on the subject, I want to say that a piece of advice that was super helpful that somebody, like a writer, just tweeted out, and I was like, whoa, yeah. It's like when you see an article on your timeline, like 15 best books of whatever, the YA books that'll change your life, the da-da-da, they were like, don't click on the link, because if you were on it, somebody would have already tagged you. And so, you know, you go to the
Yes.
hope your name there, and it's like, if your name was on there, your publicist would have told you. If you're,
Yeah.
you would have already gotten the notification. So don't go there seeking all that. Also, you know, and to that end, like, we didn't get into this. And Adiba, you said this in an interview somewhere. I'm gonna Diva stan everybody, just so you know. You were, you know, I think you said this. I hope I'm not messing up the quote. It's like, you know, our books are going to exist long past this moment. So even if we didn't get these like tours or whatever, you know, plans that we had made for, you know, debuting this year, y'all are not debuting this year, but you know what I mean. You know, putting these books out, is that the book still exists long past this moment, and the book is the thing. You didn't get into the game because you wanted to make the list. You didn't get into the game because you wanted to. I hope you didn't get into the game because you wanted to make money. Like, you do it because you want to put these books into the hands of the people that need them. And so you have to hold that as your highest priority at all times. Anything else, that's just noise.
You know, Leah, I did say that, but you said it like 1,000 times better than I did.
No, stop. That's all it is. You laid the foundation.
And I think for me, kind of one piece of advice I would go back and give myself, which I'm kind of also going to give to our 3 debuts on the panel, is that, so I'm lucky that I have a good relationship with my editor, but I wish when I was working on book 2 that I had kind of looped her in sooner. But because I was like, I was so afraid to let her down, and I was so afraid to screw up, I ended up having to write my book from scratch 4 times. And if I had just like looped her in and let her know that I was struggling, I think I could have saved myself a lot of pain and a lot of heartbreak and a lot of late nights. So for those of you who are on book 2, I thought that I would not struggle with book 2 because I'd already written so many books prior to being published, and I was so wrong. Book 2 was so hard. Like, I literally from scratch 4 times, like deleted, start over 4 times. So if you are lucky enough to have a good relationship with your editor, definitely loop them in if you're struggling, because that's what they're there for. So I have definitely learned my lesson, and I'm much more communicative, and I no longer feel, I mean, I do a little bit feel like I need to be perfect, but like I'm working on not, because it's a collaborative process between you and your editor. You're not supposed to just like spew out this perfect book in the first try. Ooh, okay, so let's wrap things up because we did go a little bit longer. So final main question. So if you could just wave a magic wand and change publishing, what would you like to see for the future of queer girl YA? And we'll start with Jen.
More of it, constantly. I want to be so sick of it. I want like the New York Times list to be full of it. I want them all to get the marketing that they deserve. That's my big wish.
I love it. Leah.
Yeah, I'd love to see us move beyond the self-fulfilling prophecy of like, these books don't sell, so we're not going to put money into marketing them, and so nobody hears about it, so nobody can buy it, and so the book fails, and it's because nobody reads these books, and so we can't take on anymore. I would love for us to move past that moment, and you know, I'm really thrilled because it feels like, you know, there's been a lot of energy surrounding Sapphic YA in particular this year and last year, and so I'm hoping this is the beginning of a movement that will eventually overwhelm the New York Times bestseller list. Ting!
That curated fake list that they do. Oh.
Right, this is me, New York Times, letting you know I am okay with being on the list. I don't have a problem with it at any time. That is fine with me.
Just put it out there.
I know you guys were waiting on me to tell you, and now I have. So like, it's fine.
Let's do it. Pump it up. All right, Adiba.
So what I would like to see in Queer Girl YA is for it to be so diverse that none of us read one book and we say, oh, this wasn't my experience, and we get sad about it, because we can just go, oh, this wasn't my experience, but there's like 10 other books that are my experience. So I just want it to be so diverse.
Awesome. Kaylin.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I want to see more queer girls, more queer Black girls in all kinds of stories, but I also would really like to see more queer women in publishing at all different levels of publishing, at acquisitions, at editorial, at marketing, at all of those, because you know, in order to make the kind of changes that we really need to see, we have to be in the room where it happens. So yeah.
Love that. And I think for me is I want to sort of like yes and all of queer girl YA is, you know, I want the coming out stories and I want ones where they're already out, and I want the contemporary, and I want to be able to have so many happy queer books that we're allowed to have sad queer books and angry queer books. Like I wanted to be able to have all of the, you know, what everybody, all of the sort of like the white cis het, you know, people have had forever. Like I want us to have that in, you know, queer girl YA that's diverse racially and, you know, and all the sort of like facets of identity. So we see more, you know, queer girls, you know, who have disabilities or who, you know, I don't know, all of the things. All of the things. I want there to be so much that we're sick of it, which I don't think is possible. So just more all the time. All right. So let's just have everybody, if you can go one more time and remind us of your book or books and where people can find you online. Adiba, you can go first.
Okay, so my book is called The Henna Wars. I'll just give the elevator pitch this time, which is it's about two teen girls with rival henna businesses who fall in love. You can find me on my website, which is adibajagirdar.com, on Twitter at adiba_J, and on Instagram at DIBS_J.
Awesome. Kaylin.
Cinderella Is Dead is out July 7th. It's right around the corner. So it's queer Black girls teaming up to overthrow the patriarchy in the former kingdom of Cinderella. You can get it everywhere books are sold. Please utilize your local indie if at all possible. And if you pre-order right now, you can get a cool like enamel pin. So the pre-order campaign is still running. I'm at Kaylin Bayron on the Twitter and Instagram, and I'm at kaylinbayron.com if you need any more information.
Awesome. Jenn.
I am Jenn, the author of Hot Dog Girl and Verona Comics. Verona Comics is the story of, it's a loose Romeo and Juliet retelling set in the comic industry, and you can get it anywhere books are sold. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at JL_Dugan, or my website is veildugan.com.
Awesome. Leah.
All right, so I am the author of You Should See Me in a Crown. It is out now. It's been out for 2 weeks now, which is really strange. I would also encourage you to buy it from your local independent bookstores. Indies are the heart of the publishing industry, and we have to keep them alive. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, because I'm vlogging now, at by Leah Johnson. I complain a lot on Twitter, and I talk about Timothée Chalamet quite a bit. So if you are interested in this person, come on over.
And I'm Isabel Stirling, author of These Witches Don't Burn and This Coven Won't Break. So we got queer witchy girls, and there's magic, murder, and mystery, and kissing. So that's that. And then I'm at isabellestirling.com. On Twitter, it's at ISA Stirling, and Instagram is at ISA_Stirling. But it's all linked right from my website, and there's a newsletter and all sorts of goodies. But thank you, everybody, for watching this panel. Thank you to all the panelists for being here. Such a lovely conversation. So now I guess we'll just say goodbye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.